Another week, another episode of our special miniseries, The History Primer. So far, we have covered political, intellectual, and social history. Today, we move to another one, cultural history. Hi, this is Likan Delaria, and you are listening to podcast Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society. Culture has been deemed a hyper-referential word because it means a lot, so much so that it has come to mean too little. It feels hard to pinpoint what precisely it is. It feels all encompassing since it essentially is all the ways we live our lives, which has been a product of knowledge transfer from one generation to another. But in the late 20th century, culture became the focus. So much so that the phenomenon has been referred to as the cultural turn. Social scientists, particularly anthropologists, became interested in understanding different cultures, religious rituals, artistic production, and various ways of life. Historians were also inspired by this new attention to culture. The scholar Miri Rubin puts it this way: the cultural turn in history asks not only how it really was, but rather how was it for him, for her, or for them. If we were to look at the past using the lens of culture, we need to go beyond what has been written and start asking questions that zone in on the manifestations of the human experience. But before the cultural turn was the social turn. Aaron discussed this in our previous episode on social history. The Annals historians are particularly credited for their contributions to this field. Their Histoire de Mentalité, or History of Mentalities, analyzed how people of a specific epoch thought about, interacted with, and classified the world around them instead of the history of particular events. Through the groundbreaking works of social historians following the Annals school, a shift in the emphasis to the history of culture was palpable, which was also exhibited by Marxist historians. Annals historians became interested in cultural practices, primarily influenced by Michel Foucault's criticism of social history. Like the Annals historians, Foucault was looking for what rules govern collective practices, and in doing so, displacing the individual as the subject of history. Foucault contributed to the development of cultural history, like the Annals and the Marxist historians, by studying culture through the lens of technologies of power, which he looked for in clinics, asylums, and prisons, or in feelings such as pain and pleasure. Since a Foucauldian analysis emphasized the operation of power, it resonated in the 1970s and the 1980s when liberation movements such as feminism, civil rights, anti-colonialism, and anti-imperialism were high. These movements were all based on a story of oppression that could also be considered a cultural story. Thus, culture was a site where power relations could be discerned. But how can historians understand events and experiences of the past? To do so required the help of anthropology. If anthropologists understood culture through fieldwork and observations, cultural historians could look into the historical traces to remake past worlds. Rituals were the most potent sources of this, as it was through rituals that cultures expressed their cultural identities. Influential in this regard is the work of Clifford Geertz, who saw rituals as a vantage point where work, kinship, religion, and rule could be seen, and through what he called thick description, a method that gained following among historians. A ritual is a public performance. It could be a carnival, a festival, a performance of epic tales, singing, dancing, and the like. Artifacts and material objects, traces of daily life, have also been perceived as texts that could be read and analyzed, and from which the past could be understood. Structures of languages have also animated the study of cultural history, as critical approaches to textual analysis have revealed that texts can inform of things they were never meant to tell. In sum, this cultural turn has been fed by a variety of critical strategies that encompass communication, the way ideas and practices circulate, the individual's agency, and the production of meaning, which led scholars of culture and history to realize that dealing with culture is dealing with the mixing of categories. As Miri Rubin puts it, this system of meanings makes order, ranks priority, and suggests valuable connections between things. Thus, cultural history requires the work of chronicling and describing traces of this meaning as they manifest in cultural expressions and manifestations of human experience through time. Somehow, this makes cultural history quite related to intellectual history since we study the beliefs and ideas of a people from a past time and place. But cultural history considers non elite notions and narratives. Extracting meaning from these groups of people requires the use of everyday objects and manifestations of daily life. Why is it important to study cultural history then? Studying cultural history allows us to understand why and see how societies change. When the study of history was described as time travel, perhaps what they had in mind was cultural history, since we talk about things and objects that we, as everyday people, can relate to. In the Philippines, cultural history broadly looks at cultural traditions and interpretations of the Philippine historical experience through the distinctive ways our various ethno-linguistic groups live. Therefore, our cultural history is the aggregate of the Filipino people's past cultural activities such as rituals, customs, ceremonies, practices, traditions, and others. Of particular interest to historians was the culture of our ancestors erased through colonialism. Through cultural history, we can draw a picture of what our ancestors were like and how they lived through non-written texts such as epic poetry and other verbal forms passed on orally from one generation to another. We learn about their cultural expressions of science, art, craftsmanship, technique, and others. While the actual performance of this culture may only have traces of them remaining today, it is from these same traces that we could understand how early Philippine societies lived. For one, epic poetry is a rich source of information about our ancestors' past. Epics are a series of stories told through song and are recited and memorized by notable members of early Philippine societies. Through the work of anthropologists such as Felipe Ocano, epics were recorded and encoded to print, providing us a window to the historical era rendered mute and invisible because of centuries of colonialism. Another source by which we could view our past is through folklore. In 1889, Isabella de los Reyes published a collection of Filipino folklore, arguing that folklore is a repository of knowledge of the past, as it allows the understanding and reconstruction of the history and culture of a people. For cultural historian Resil Mujares, de los Reyes was collecting folklore with the belief that from this collection, the anti-colonial struggle of Filipinos may proceed. Other notable works on Philippine cultural history include Bernadette Abrera's work on boat building traditions and her studies of amulets or anting-anting. Another is Dante Ambrosio's studies on ethnoastronomy and the myths that explain the stars in the Philippine sky and their function in the lives of early Filipino societies. Studies of Philippine cultural history extend beyond the attempt to glimpse a previous life without colonizers. Studies of Filipino culture during the colonial period are also present, such as the work on colonial printing by Mujares, which called for a more nuanced analysis of the Spanish colonial period. Vicente Rafael analyzed the role of language in the religious conversion of Tagalogs and their colonization by the Spaniards. Stephanie Koo looked into clothing and fashion in the 19th century Philippines to refract colonial life. Reynaldo Ileto used the religious performance of the Passion as source material for understanding popular movements in the Philippines at the turn of the 19th century. Marlon De Lupio analyzed poems from the Sakdal movement of the 1930s. Teresita Jimenez Maceda used songs to tell the history of the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas. Raul Navarro studied music during martial law. Indeed, the writing of cultural history and the endeavor of materializing a Philippine history through culture is alive and present, pushing us to look into our past, beyond traditional sources, and understanding how the people of the past made meaning out of their world and their experiences. That's about it for this episode. I hope you learned something from this short introduction. Perhaps you'd also be interested to check out some of the works mentioned in this episode. If you want more of podcasts, check out our past and regular seasons. I'm sure there's plenty to tickle your fancy. Next week, we look into another historical subdiscipline. Until then, stay safe and have a good day. Mhm.